What if mass migration is what caused the Roman Empire to collapse? Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, this is going to get me in a lot of trouble. Some Stanford scientists only very recently ran a brilliant study on the genetics of ancient Rome. They took a variety of corpses which came from the various periods of Roman history, and they checked the genetics to try analyze where these people were from. And here we have a lovely little video presenting their study and what they found.
We collected DNA from ancient skeletons from in and around Rome, spanning over the last 12,000 years, and we analysed these DNA samples to understand the history of the Roman population. I'm Jonathan Pritchard. I'm in the Department of Biology and Genetics at Stanford University.
I'm Hannah Moots. I'm a PhD student at Stanford in anthropology, and I've been lucky enough to work on this project where we've looked at ancient DNA from 29 different sites in and around Rome. That's 127 individuals spanning the last 12,000 years.
And in particular, we were interested in understanding the shifts in the population during the historical period during the Roman Empire. We found that there were tremendous amounts of immigration into Rome during the historical period, and that these reflected in many cases political alliances of Rome with other parts of Europe and the Mediterranean.
So a quick analogy for anybody who's not that familiar with Roman history. In the beginning, Rome was quite humble and small, the little republic. Very much like how America began, you know, all these Anglos come over from England and they settle America and create this sort of republican state, this small little insular republic. Now, in the 20th century, what has America turned into? America is this enormous global imperium that essentially rules the world. And the population of America is way more diversified as a consequence. There's many, many more people inside of America now. And maybe at the start of America, they took in a couple of Irish people, a couple of Swedes, a couple of Germans, and maybe some Italians. But even that was like sort of stretching what they wanted to do. Now in the 20th century, they have Mexicans, they have Asians, they have people from Far Eastern Europe and stuff like this. There's everybody from all across the world is like, come to America, come hang out, this type of thing. And so the imperial age of America is far more cosmopolitan. Now, what this starts to show us is that Rome was very, very similar. It had an early republic age, and then it went on to have an imperial age, and there was a dramatic shift in the ethnicities as a consequence.
So according to myth, Rome was founded in the Iron Age in around 753 BCE by the twins Romulus and Remus. In this period, Rome was a small city-state, like many of its neighbors in central Italy. But in the next centuries, it starts to grow, first across the Italian peninsula, and then it starts to expand across the Mediterranean to North Africa, other parts of Europe, and the Near East.
So one of the most interesting things that we see is that during the first century CE, which is really the heart of the imperial period, we see at that time that there's a huge amount of immigration that's coming into Rome, mainly from the Near East, coming either directly or indirectly. And that's enough to actually shift the average ancestry of people who are living in Rome to look much more Eastern at that time.
We get to late antiquity, and this period is characterized by a lot of political change. The Roman Empire starts to fall apart. It breaks into an eastern and a western half. The capital moves from Rome to Constantinople. And what we're seeing genetically actually reflects some of these shifts, which is interesting. So we see sort of shift away from Near Eastern ancestry, and we see more individuals who are living in Rome with ancestry from Western and Northern Europe.
One thing that's really striking to me is how much immigration there was at different times from different places, so that the genetic makeup of the population is shifting significantly from time to time over periods of just a few centuries. And then secondly, starting from almost 3,000 years ago, Rome was already a very cosmopolitan place. So living side by side in the same population are people who have ancestry from quite different places, including from Europe, from North Africa, from the Near East. And even within time periods, there's a lot of mixing of different kinds of people. So it's kind of like Rome was a melting pot, even going back very far into the past.
Now, this graph paints an astounding picture on many different levels. And again, I'm going to use a very imperfect analogy by comparing it to America here, but it will help you understand exactly what you're looking at, because the story even starts before the arrival of the Romans. You can see in the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, the Copper Age, you're seeing there's different population changes. So Europe, modern genetics have shown us, had these hunter-gatherers who were roaming around the forests, and they were all quite tan with blue eyes and dark hair. And then in comes out of the Middle East the people who made like Göbekli Tepe and stuff like this, these farmers. These are called the Neolithic farmers, the early European farmers. And they swooped up and started to sort of replace these hunter-gatherers. And this would have been this original conflict. And you can imagine this like over in America, long before, you know, we showed up, the Aztecs were fighting with the Mayans. You know, you had the Mayans fighting with the Aztecs. There was these populations fighting with each other that European history didn't even understand or know about. And basically what happens is these early European farmers win and they take over the territory for thousands of years. And this is the population that exists in Italy at this time. And we call these people Sardinians because the modern Sardinians essentially have their DNA. The modern Sardinians, I think, are 97% the same as these people. So if you want to look at what the early European farmers who replaced the hunter-gatherers looked like, go to Sardinia. Sardinia, for example, is interestingly where Napoleon comes from, or he comes from Corsica on top of it. It's a little island in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it's been sort of untouched by these invasions. So it's a special place, a preservation of a people who have been long diluted into the broader European project. Now, you might have heard, of course, of the famous Indo-European chariot warriors who swooped down out of the Russian steppe, the herdsmen who came into the Russian steppe and sort of conquered all of Europe. And these are the people who brought the language that we are speaking. The Gaelic Irish, for example, is Indo-European. English comes from Germanic, is Indo-European. Spanish, Indo-European. French, it's all, Latin, Greek, all Indo-European. And these guys came in and they essentially replaced these early European farmers, these Neolithics. So this would have been something like the Europeans maybe coming over first. So you can think of the English going over to America and coming in contact with the American Indians. So these American Indians now are sort of like these early European farmers. They're living inside of America, and then the English come over and start to replace them and set up a republic. And this is sort of like what happens with the Romans. The Romans swoop in and they conquer these Sardinians and kind of boot them out and send them maybe over to the islands. And they set up their Roman Republic. And so this is the first stage of the rise of Rome. And at this point, we're seeing in the genetics, the Iron Age, the Roman Republic, it's 72% European, which means that it's like very close to what we are now. And this European maybe would be like Celtic, Gaelic, Gaelic meaning like Gallic, France, even modern Spain. And I think the genetics they've done on this shows that that's the kind of population that you're looking at, is like southern France, Spain, northern Italy. That's the kind of the European contingent that they're talking about. And of course, this is the bulk of the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic constitutes these guys in this small little city-state until they go through a transition period, which Julius Caesar pivots off, and then they create their grand empire. And this is like America going from being its small insular state that I've said before, and instead expanding itself into this grand imperium that rules the world. And then at that point you see the ancestry gets crazy different, to the point where it becomes kind of frightening, because the Europeans in the Roman Republic who had come over, just like the English who came over, they started at 72% of the population. And by the time of Imperial Rome, they are only 4% of the population. They are essentially entirely replaced. Now, I'm not putting out any political opinions here for the sake of all that is good and true. I'm just trying to observe some evidence. But this is, of course, interesting to notice how similar this is to what is happening in America, modern America. You would have had traditional America, the Republic America, if you will, before it became a world hegemon. It was very heavily European, very heavily even English, if you wish to put it this way, to the point of like 85% or something like this. And then you had, of course, black people in there who would have been about 13%. And that was basically the American population, a couple of American Indians in there as well. And now in modern America, I think there might be at like 50% last time they checked of European ancestry, and rapidly growing with these other populations coming in. And you have lots of Hispanics coming in, you have people from all across the world, lots of Asians showing up now as well. So there's a large transformation happening in America, and the European quartet is starting to drop significantly, going under 50%, and they're on their way to becoming a minority in America. And this seems like it happened in Imperial Rome. Now that's like crazy in and of itself, because it's like, wow, why did this happen? What does this tell us? What does this mean? Now, I'm going to discuss all this later because it's way more interesting and nuanced than you might think. But this also leads us then into the questions about what happened after this. Like you see, for example, this huge rise of Near Eastern ancestry. Near Eastern ancestry would have been like the Levant, the Jews, the Syrians, the people from maybe Turkey, stuff like that. Modern Turkey now, the Turks are different people, confusing stuff. But they became over a quarter of the Roman Imperium, and they didn't exist in the Roman Republic, and they didn't exist afterwards, after the collapse of Rome. So it seems like there's this extremely serious population transformation, and it actually rose and then vanished because of whatever political situations went down, and some very extreme political situations certainly did go down. By the time we get into late antiquity, what we're seeing here is a return of the European population. It goes from 4% up to 30%, so a third, which is not actually 72% anymore, but it is still pretty significant. But we also see the eradication of the Near Eastern population. So the people here who we call Near Eastern have vanished again. Now this, of course, coincides with the return of the Goths. The Goths were the Germans from around about Sweden, Poland, obviously Germany. And they swooped down into Rome after the Roman political order fell apart. And they would have brought a huge amount more, you could say, Northern European blood into Rome during late antiquity, which transformed Rome yet again. There's a part of Rome called Lombardy. And these Lombards are essentially Germans. You know, you meet a lot of them, they're all like blonde, blue eyes, and you're thinking, are these guys from Munich or are they from Germany, you know? And the Lombards were known as a Gothic tribe that swooped in. And so quite a lot, even nowadays, like quite a lot of modern Italy is a blend of the northern Italy, which has got quite a significant Northern European influence, compared to Southern Italy, which is much more attached to the Mediterranean DNA and things like this. So you see Rome transforming a huge amount over the cycles of history. Now, allow me to be a bit of a dork and talk about Nuance. Of course, they only had 127 corpses that they tested here, so it's not a huge sample size. What you're getting is quite low resolution. So this population number of going from 72% European, for example, to 4%, that seems like a very significant change, essentially an entire replacement of the population. Maybe in the future, better studies will be done on this and will show it won't be as dramatic or something like this. Nonetheless, I do think these general trends are probably true because of things that we know actually from history that we can speak about. So allow me to speculate and paint a bit more of a broader picture as to what we may be looking like, how the story of history may have played out, informed by these genetics. And the first question you should ask yourself is, how did the Romans who built the Roman Empire end up replacing themselves? That's the question. That seems like a bit of a self-own. Surely if you're going to build an imperium, you want it to serve you and make you powerful. You're building an imperium that conquers the world. Why would you allow it to get rid of you? That makes me scratch my chin. And of course, there's actually very fascinating reasons for this, and some of these are going to sound quite familiar. So the main thing we're going to look at is the transition from the Republic into the Empire, where it became cosmopolitan and multicultural, where it became this big melting pot of all these different identities. It went from being a sort of Roman native will-to-power state into this giant imperium that carried the name Rome, but actually its constituents were not Roman, or not ethnically Roman. They were new Romans or something like this. Now, you might say to yourself, oh, well, like, is this going to be some, reactionary rant or something like this? Actually, no, it might have been the Romans themselves who did this. It might literally have been a self-own, because when you study Roman history, you'll start to see many of these patterns showing up early. For example, in Julius Caesar's time, Julius Caesar got all his power because the aristocracy in Rome was actually exploiting the Roman natives by bringing in cheap labor and using that to replace their own native population. So the Roman aristocracy were focused on being a political elite, and the whole idea was that you couldn't go become a Roman working in the parliament, working in the Senate, unless you had enough land that you didn't need a job, because the Senate didn't pay you money. You couldn't be a paid politician. So you had to have enough cash, enough wealth that you could go and attend to the Senate, free. That was the whole concept, is that the Senate was an aristocracy because you needed to be wealthy enough to participate in it. And so all of the men who ran in the Senate were all wealthy landowning men. And these men would then be focused on developing political dignity for themselves. Where we get the word dignity from is dignitas, which is actually more akin to the idea of like status, you know, flexing, being a badass. And so the Roman idea of how you become a great man or an important man is that you have to go off and conquer another country. That's how you win prestige. That's how you win dignitas. That's how you win high status. And so the Romans, they would go into the Senate and they would organize among themselves, and then they would say, well, we need to go to war against this country. And everybody would be like, I'll go be the political commander. And they take their legions out and they go and conquer them. And then what they do is they need to organize their farm when they got back home, these aristocrats. And what had these Romans just achieved? They had just conquered a load of slaves. They'd gone out to Dacia, which is like Romania, or they've gone out to Judea, or they've gone up to Gaul, or they've gone over to Spain, and they've conquered all these dorks, these idiots, these fools. And so what they'd say is they'd be like, well, these guys could work for free. So I could bring them all back to my farm, and I could get them to run my farm while I go up and live in Rome and become a political badass who, you know, runs around and does my parades now that I'm a big conqueror. And so this began to happen over and over again. These rich elites would go out and conquer places, and because of their success, they would get this abundance of slaves and bring them back and have them work the land in Rome, because it's free, cheap labor. Now, what would happen then? Well, this becomes a bit of a problem for the native Romans who aren't aristocrats. These are these other landowning Romans who live in the lands of Italy and till the soils, and they're trying to, you know, scrounge by. And they find themselves competing with these aristocratic I'm not going to say plantations, but like these aristocratic farms that are run on slave labor. And before that, maybe the aristocrats might have even hired the native Romans and brought them in, and that would be a good way for them to make a bit of cash to get by. Now they don't get those jobs anymore. And now the price of all those jobs significantly drop because slave labor is dropping down the cost of labor. And all of a sudden what happens is these native Romans are fucked, because they're like, all right, well, we can't work at home. My farm's not profitable because I can't sell my stuff in the market because I'm getting outcompeted by all these slave farms. And then usually what a lot of them would do is say, right, I'll go fight in the army because at least in the army I can make some cash. And so then these young Roman men would leave their farm, go and fight in the legions, hoping that they could make their fortune. Probably not make their fortune. They'd come back and actually find that what they've done is they've gone and supported one of these political elites, gone and killed some Spanish blokes or something like this, and brought loads of them back to be slaves, further contributing to the problem. And then they'd come back home. Their farm had been derelict because nobody had been really taking care of it, apart from their old mother with a bad back cooking pasta or whatever the fuck the Italians did back then. And they would come back, and all of a sudden that farm down the road had grown even bigger, and then they'd go up to that farm and they'd be like, they just to check it out, and they'd see all the slaves that they just conquered working on the farm, and they'd be like, what did I do? And so then these Roman veterans who served as legionaries would be broke. They would not be able to compete. They'd probably even have to sell their farm to the aristocrat, which allows him to expand his farm even bigger. And they'd essentially have nothing. And so they'd move into the city. And they'd move into the city. And again, what's the city full of? Slaves. Because the Romans love slaves. So they go into the city, and in there, it's very hard to compete for wages because everybody's, you know, running on slaves. And so they'd end up all in ghettos and apartments. These native Romans would end up in ghettos and apartments because the slaves are doing all the work. Because slaves work for free, native Romans expect wealth, expect pay. And Caesar showed up in this environment. Caesar realized that all these disgruntled native Romans are an incredibly useful political force. Caesar's whole family is that he was called a popularis, which is where we get the word populist from. And he was a representative of the people against the aristocracy, who were called the optimates. And the aristocracy were trying to preserve this order, where they were like this conquering elite that reached out and took more lands and created this like badass republic thing for themselves. And it seems all cool in theory until you start to realize what is actually happening. These aristocrats, this small group of aristocrats, had created an entire slave caste underneath them that actually shunted out their own native people and made everything a problem. And so by the time of Julius Caesar, what we see is that all of these trends had been baked into the cake and happening for quite a while. And weirdly, it's coming from the greed and the lust and the sort of incentives that the aristocrats had set up for themselves. Wanting to be a master race had led them to replace their own population and sort of weirdly subvert their own empire. Now, by the time of the end of the Roman Empire, 50% of the cities were slaves. So this leads to question one. Did the Roman master morality aristocrats mass migrate themselves out of existence because of their appetite and lust for slaves? There's some other interesting trends as well. Like, for example, Rome is the center of world commerce. It's the big place where you could go make a name for yourself. The American dream is the Roman dream back in these times. So there's every incentive for everyone around the empire and in the empire to flock towards Rome, because there's cash to be made, there's trade, there could be interesting opportunities there. It becomes the center of the world. Even somebody like St. Paul, who spreads Christianity, can only do so because he's a citizen of Rome and is capable of pushing into Rome and moving about it in a very dynamic way to spread the word. Another trend as well is that there's a fertility crisis happening among the native Romans. They just simply stopped breeding. And this is something that even Augustus was doing when he established the empire. The first emperor was trying to create this incentive for the native Romans to breed. He was trying to do things where he would encourage women to have more kids and encourage men to stick in their marriages and stuff like this, because they weren't doing it. They were noticing a drop in fertility. And this is a kind of funny and consistent recurring problem of high civilization. Think about modern Western Europe and modern America and, like, you know, the European world. If you want to look at it, like all of their countries, Australia and everything, the fertility rates are plummeting. And the Europeans are just not breeding enough to replace themselves. It's like, why? They've reached this point where they have all the food that they could want, all the wealth that they could want, all the conveniences that they could want. Surely that would lead to a propagation, an endless pouring out of more children. But no, instead it leads to the opposite. It seems like wealth leads to luxury and freedom. These things don't lead to incredible fertility. Instead, it's like the opposite. It seems like it leads to a sterility of sorts. And there's a lot of interesting... It's as complicated as a problem as the immigration one. And so why does this happen? It could be a litany of things. Maybe comfort leads to people saying stuff like, why should I give up this beautiful life of wealth and nice food and travel and experiences for the toil and responsibility of a child? Why should I do that? Maybe it's a consequence of abundant sex slaves. Maybe the whole problem of slavery actually comes in to subvert fertility itself, because you have these political marriages, and the Romans had to marry native Romans for their proper relationship, but they were allowed to have sex slaves on the side if they wished, and they would often create children with these sex slaves, and maybe they got their sexual appetites fulfilled this way, and this would have a subversive effect upon marriages. That could be something as well. Maybe it's a consequence of money problems like usury and stuff like this. So for example, the Romans doing lots of printing of cash, and so even though they have like a lot of abundance, there's still a lot of pressure on them to make wealth, and so this actually leads to constricted living places and this sort of like dirtiness and feeling of lack of freedom, and so people don't want to have kids as well. There could be all sorts of interesting reasons as a consequence, and who knows, but all that we know is that the bottom line is that the Romans stopped producing children, which of course is a cacophony of different trends. You have all these people moving in for commerce reasons, all these people getting dragged in, kicking and screaming into this giant hell, which is the slavery empire of Rome, and then the plummeting fall of the native Romans' fertility. And of course, this all cascades into a great replacement of the ancient Romans in the end. Now, another quite shocking part of this is how rapidly this transformation happened. And the people who did the study noticed this as well. It was surprising to us how rapidly the population ancestry shifted, over timescales of just a few centuries. Another striking aspect was how cosmopolitan the population of Rome was, starting more than 2,000 years ago and continuing through the rise and dissolution of the empire. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, this is this idea that as Rome went from the political order of the Republic into the Imperium, it was an enormous change. Like a huge change from 72% European Roman into 4% in the empire, and this entire almost 40% of the empire being Near Eastern ancestry, which then again just rapidly drops out. There's a gentleman called What If All History who was commenting, and I was chatting with about this, and he was saying that the reason why these dramatic shifts happen is because urban life is not very fertile, and so when all these populations come in and live in the city, they're only ever going to be temporary. And then once the breakdown of order happens, these people are all going to move out or maybe even get killed or something like this. They're going to get outbred by the healthier barbarians and the native farmers and stuff like this. And so that, of course, could be something to consider. But now that we've set the stage, let's get to the idea that will get me in the most trouble. All of this transformation during the imperial age leads to an uncomfortable premonition, because it was the imperial age during the empire when Rome fell. Rome fell specifically after this replacement of its population. The grand transformation preceded the collapse of the Roman Empire in absolute terms. What came before the Roman Empire was the Republic, which was a conquering people, the Romans, establishing a political order and rising something up out of the ground. What came after the Roman Empire was the invasion of the Gothic barbarians, which again were kings who came in and asserted a new Western order and essentially created the modern West, the Christian Germanic kings of the next 2,000 years. But what happened in the Roman Empire was not necessarily a conquest. It was this mass migration of slaves by the greedy Romans, which acted as an erosion, a corrosive force that seemed like it tore apart the fabric of imperial Roman society and essentially destroyed the entire project and drove it into the ground. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I think this might have happened. Now, a major part of this was the patriotic idea of what was the meaning of Rome, because there was a widespread loss of faith. Towards the end, nobody cared about Rome at all. This is quite famous. The natives didn't really want to fight and die for this empire because they didn't feel like it was their empire anymore. They go to Rome and, you know, only 4% of the people there are native Romans, and everybody else seems like they're from the Levant or something like this. And they're like, I don't know, this isn't me. I'm not going to die for this. Whereas in the Republic, these young legionaries, these young native Romans, of course, they would have been bricking the fight for the Roman army because it was their thing. And then, of course, all these poor slaves who were dragged in kicking and screaming by these Roman aristocrats and shoved into the slave plantations, and eventually, you know, managed to work themselves so they didn't get raped and killed. They managed to work themselves into a position of success and then actually became established in Rome. They're still not too interested in fighting for the empire. They don't really care about Rome. In fact, Rome, in their consciousness, is an evil empire that enslaved their ancestors. And it's like, why do I want to be a part of that? Now, of course, this should sound very familiar to the woes that many Western armies are having. Because you have these modern Western armies, and people are, you know, the people in America would say, well, I don't want to fight for the American army because that was the army that enslaved my ancestors. And then all the Native American guys, you know, who go back to the Mayflower and stuff, they're like, I don't want to fight for this army anymore because it doesn't represent me. This American empire it wants me to go off and die in Iraq for oil money or something like this. And people just have lost the faith in the whole concept of the West and America, and which is essential for an army. You need to have that type of morale where people just don't believe. And Rome has that very same problem. Towards the end, the Goths basically just rambled in with very little opposition, with a much less sophisticated force in some sense, definitely not the grand military tradition of the Romans, but because they had will, they had like organized squadrons of men, they were able to dominate this enormous empire and basically just kick down the door and the entire structure just falls. Now, just an interesting side note here, Edward Gibbon, who spoke about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire a long time ago, traditionally people would see migration as having a big impact on the fall of Rome, but not actually the one we're speaking about here, because these genetic tests show us a much different story than the sort of traditional notion, because what history remembers is actually more of the later migrations, when the Romans did stuff like welcome in hordes of Goths into the northern frontiers, which is widely seen as just an idiotic move, because then these Goths were now in the Roman Empire, right beside the political polity, and then when they noticed Rome was weak, they all just got organized and took it over. And so people would say mass migration destroyed Rome because they imported in a foreign army, essentially, sat it inside their borders. And then when the time was right, these guys just swung into activity. Now, that's true to an extent, but the more fundamental thing we're looking at here that is not as mentioned in the histories, because the genetics tell a slightly different story, is that by that point, Rome had already been corroded and essentially entirely transformed by the slave importations and things like this. Now, the second major consequence of this is the political destabilization and cultural destabilization that happens, which is very similar to people losing belief in the idea of Rome, but this is down to enormous transformations. For example, from moving the capital somewhere else. So moving it from Rome to Constantinople, which is famously what happened. And of course, the rise of Christianity and the conversion of the empire to a new religion. Now, you have to think about how this new importation of slaves happening in a republic about 300 years later is essentially completely transformed the empire to it becoming something entirely new and entirely alien to where it came from. And this is because many of these slaves would become free over the generations, and they would work their way into bureaucracies, and actually some fascinating incentives start to show up. So for example, freed slaves tended to be more trustworthy than native Romans for a variety of different reasons. And oftentimes freed slaves would be given permission to run the estates of wealthy Romans. So an aristocrat would bring in a group of slaves and he would find an intelligent slave. There'd be one or two intelligent slaves who were very good at organizing teams, and he'd promote them to organize a little farming team. And then he'd eventually say, well, listen, like usually the wife would take care of everything, but maybe the wife and the freed slave would say, hey, why don't you take care of this and run my operations because you're very smart, and I'm going to go off and fight and I'll come back. And then they would do this and they would gain an awful lot of status, and then they'd actually sometimes gain wealth. They'd get freed, maybe they get some money, and now they're like actually kind of credible. Oh, that was the dude who ran, you know, Lucius's farm really, really well. That's absolutely fantastic. Oftentimes some of these slaves would find Roman women who were in their 40s and they were very wealthy, coming from aristocratic families, you know, the daughter of a wealthy conquering general. And she would need somebody to, you know, she would need a lover of sorts. And so she would come across some slave or a freed slave, and she'd, you know, satisfy herself with him, and they'd fall in love. And she would leave her entire estate to him in the will, and stuff like this would happen. And all of a sudden you have these people who are slaves owning significant plots of land, being very high up in operations. And of course then the emperors started to notice that the bureaucracy was better ran by these types of slaves because they had no loyalties. So their corruption was, you know, they're different in the way that they act, and they tended to be very loyal to the empire because this was their only path out of essentially thraldom, you know. So they were going to be unbelievably loyal for this. And so all of a sudden you have all of these freed slaves, these legacy slaves, owning large plots of land, being sort of prestigious in business, and now populating the bureaucracy. What was left of the Roman farmers towards the end of the empire, you know, this 4% of native Romans, they would go into their local administration in the city and they would find just a cacophony of foreigners running their government. And the bureaucracy was all foreigners. The entire streets was just like not them anymore, and they'd be like, they wouldn't have a clue what is happening. But this is what would happen. And often these Roman farmers were the leftover legacy of the landed elite, of the aristocrats who were left over, you know, these small families that were sort of echoing now throughout history, that had been, you know, a prestigious family back in the past, but there was just none of them left. Their fertility rates are too low. Various things like this led to an awful lot of problems. Towards the end, many of the emperors ended up coming from foreign territories. So what sort of happened is all the emperors at the start, Augustus and all of them, they were Roman. They were like, you know, of the Julius Caesar clan, and they then would stay very, very Roman, very, very, you know, Italian, from the Italian peninsula. And then what happens is it begins to branch out. As the empire gets instantiated, you start to see like North Africans, people maybe from Egypt, maybe a Greek dude, a Spanish dude or something like this. And at this point you get a guy called Caracalla, and Caracalla puts in a law which is a citizenship law, and there's a variety of reasons why he might have done this, but it's more than likely for the sake of the army. And this means that anybody can become a Roman citizen. And so this again opens up this other incentive of the American dream, the Roman dream, where all these Romans want to come into Rome now because they have this opportunity to transform into citizens if they're within the territory. So citizen moves from being this sort of native privilege, because if you were a citizen, you were essentially the opposite of being a slave. You were someone who had the privilege of the law protecting them, and you had very high status. Like the only higher status obviously would be to be from a prestigious family. Now citizenship was like given to everybody, including slave territories. And people like Caracalla start to become more common. And so towards the end, like the Roman emperors are just coming from everywhere. You're having like, you know, French ones, and they're all just spilling in, and it's just moving around. And all of a sudden now the emperors are all foreign. The capital gets moved. And of course, the very, very significant transformation in Christianity. Now, why did Christianity happen? I don't want to go ragging on Christians or anything like this, but it definitely has to be like you have to look at it and say this was a Near Eastern religion that came from the Near East. Maybe this was God's intention. He wanted to, you know, create a very countervailing morality to this aristocratic morality. Maybe this aristocratic morality in Rome was supposed to be the ultimate exposure of the problems, the inherent contradictions of master morality, where you have Rome, the ultimate master morality, subverting itself through slavery. And then we have one of these slaves come in and conquer Rome, which is almost like this great dramatic revelation of the new order of morality or something like this. The slave morality comes in and demonstrates a different path. Maybe that's what happened, you know. But regardless of how God's mastery works, we do have this very difficult problem, which is Christianity came just as this slave state was blossoming and this transformation had happened. Once Rome had transformed into a 4% imperium with 40% Near Eastern population, essentially, as Rome transformed, Christianity grew. And the more Rome became a multicultural melting pot, the more Christianity grew. And you could look at Christianity in some sense as a replacement religion for an ethnic religion. The Roman gods, the ancient Indo-European gods that were thousands of years old, that did perfectly fine creating the Roman Empire, these were completely replaced because nobody believed in them. Those gods were the oppressors of the past. Those gods were the, you know, these were the tyrants. What did the Romans do in Judea? They went in and they plopped an image of Jupiter in the Temple Mount. They humiliated the Jews with Jupiter. Jupiter was standing there in front of them, asserting Roman power upon them. And so their consciousness of Jupiter is as a tyrant, as a monster, as a demon, as a beast, as an oppressor. And so when all these slaves come into Rome, they see these Roman gods as the ethnic representation of the oppressor class. They're sort of like in modern America, it's like all the statues that you see of like Robert Lee and stuff like this. These statues of the great conquerors of the past. These are symbols to the native populations of America and the West as the powerful. But to the people that were the legacy people who were conquered by these men, these are demons. They want to destroy them. They demand that they are pulled down. They demand that these gods are stripped and melted down and smelted and destroyed, and these statues are pulled down. And Christianity was sort of like this, a sort of twilight of the idols for the Roman gods. In fact, when Christianity took over, this was an enormous event where they began to pull down all of the Roman gods and accusing them of being demons. Augustine wrote how the Roman gods weren't able to protect Rome from the invasions of the Goths, because the Roman gods had lost their power and stuff like this. It was a twilight, a Ragnarok, a twilight of the idols, a fall of the gods, if you will. And Christianity comes in, and Christianity is very popular among the slaves, of course, very popular among the recent immigrants, very popular among the cities. And of course, the cities were essentially giant slave camps at this point. Or that's maybe not even correct. They weren't slave camps. They were now at this point legacy slave camps. And all these people in the cities don't identify with these Roman oppressive gods. Why would they? And so we have this new religion of a slave, which is what Jesus was. You know, he was a subject of the Roman Empire from, like, you know, essentially murdered by the Roman state. And he represents the martyr, the image to these people of a man who was oppressed, a man who was like them, like their ancestors. He had been through what they had gone through. And this would speak to them, this would give them way more positive identity. They would understand themselves through him. They would see Christ and say to themselves, God, well, that's what happened to us. Whereas these Roman gods, you know, Mars and Jupiter being like, oh, we're so big and powerful. They'd be like, that's not us. These are the horrible bastards who hurt us. So you see this fundamental political transformation, which changes the identity of Rome. And Christianity becomes state official religion in 390 AD, and Rome falls 410, 20 years later. Less, it was 19 years later. So it's like, incredibly fast. That would be like if America changed to its religion in 2001, and by 2020 America had fallen and been invaded. It's like, that's how fast it would happen. It would happen within 20 years. And that's exactly what happened. That's how it went down. Within the next 100 years, Rome was basically eviscerated at that point. So it's clear that a new people led to a new Rome. It's clear that it transformed Rome in a fundamental level. And this is so jarring when you really let your imagination understand what this actually means, that it makes you wonder, is there some type of limit or destiny tied into success, or what it means to be a master or a conqueror? Because what was Jesus representing at this incredibly important period of history, which is the transition from, the ultimate master morality, which is Rome, into the ultimate slave morality, which is Christianity, there is actually sort of an exposure of what happened to Rome here, because their success led to their destruction. Through the seeds of their power led to their inherent self-subversion. It's quite incredible when you think about it. And you see this happen to England as well, and you see this happening to America. Take, for example, the British Empire. Like right now, I think most of the major political figures leading the British nation, leading the United Kingdom, I think they're all from the colonies, either Pakistan or India. I'm not sure if Pakistan was a colony, but you know what I'm saying anyway. That they're foreign, they're foreign emperors essentially. And you look at London. London is now, I think, 30% British. Like, they've been essentially completely replaced out of their capital city. And this is astounding when you see this, because you think to yourself, the English were the most recent master race. They were the most recent world conquerors. They conquered us Irish. They conquered India. They conquered all of Africa, basically. They built America. They conquered Australia. They basically had the whole world as theirs. They were just incredible in the lengths that they went and the defeats that they managed to wage upon people. And they took over so many different places. Yet we've reached this period of history now where, despite their incredible explosion of power, we're starting to see a sort of subversion of themselves. All the places that they conquered are starting to flood in. And the Irish, for example, flooded into England for like decades at this point, well over a century at this point. You speak to English people now, and it's like not very uncommon to find somebody with English-Irish ancestry. It's become a big thing. And so the Irish conquered race have in some sense made their way into the English population to a large extent and gotten intermarried. And now you have all the Indians coming over and all the people from Africa and from Jamaica, like there's specific colonies that they had where they're now flooding in. Is this some sort of Greek dramatic tragedy? If you have the hubris, the power to conquer, inevitably, if you keep on pushing in that direction and expand into being an imperium, you will eventually get replaced by your subjects, by your slaves. Because this is what happened in Rome. And you wonder if the Europeans during the Dark Ages, stuff like this never happened to them, They never had such a problem. They had Muslims maybe coming in as warriors, but they never had this issue where their own success subverted them. So this is quite a frightening and foreboding story of what happened to the native Roman people. It seems like the genetics tell us that they rose up and created their republic, and it rolled forward into history, into their empire. They became incredibly successful. And by the end, they had become sterile and irrelevant. They had been replaced entirely in their own homeland. They had lost political representation in their own state. They had their ancestral religion overturned, cast out, and banished. And they fell victim to barbarian kings. And you think, at such a price, is empire really worth it?